Latin Amerika son 4 yıldır ikinci pembe dalga olarak adlandırılan yeni bir dönemden geçiyor. ...2018'den bu yana kıta genelinde çeşitli ülkeler en genel tabirle sol kanatta sayılan liderlerin yönetimine geçti. Son olarak da Brezilya'da düzenlenen seçimlerin ardından başkanlık koltuğuna Lula da Silva oturdu. Tabii Lula, Brezilyalılar için yeni bir isim değil. Lula, Brezilya'da daha önce de başkanlık yaptı. Uyguladığı politikalarla halkın sevgisini kazandı. Daha sonra yolsuzlukla suçlandı, hapse atıldı, aklandı, yeniden başkanlık yarışına girdi ve kazandı. Lula, hapisten çıktığında bir adamı tutuklamadılar, bir fikri öldürmeye çalıştılar demişti. Şimdi o fikir Brezilya'da yeniden iktidarda. Peki Lula kim? Brezilya siyasetindeki yeri neresi? Amacı ne? Bugüne kadar neler başardı? Sosyalist mi, liberal mi? Yoksa Soros'un adamı mı? Bütün bu soruların yanıtını gazeteci ve yazar Ben Norton'dan alacağız.
It's not a war for democracy, it's not a war for freedom.
Norton, Amerikan dış politikasına odaklanan bir isim. Kendisi Latin Amerika'da yaşıyor ve Latin Amerika siyasetinde yakından takip ediyor. Dünya çapında çok sayıda analizi ve röportajı yayınlanan Norton'ın adını çok kutupluluktan alan Multipolariste isimli de bir internet sitesi var.
Öyleyse daha fazla vakit kaybetmeden Ben Norton'a soralım. Kim bu Lula?
Welcome, Mr. Norton. Thank you for having time for us.
It's my pleasure, thanks for having me.
After Lula's victory, we see that certain criticisms are targeting with a leftist narrative. Is that true? How can you define Lula's ideology and political stance? Will he implement Western liberal agenda, or does he have any ties with names like Mr. George Soros?
Yeah, this narrative is ridiculous. First of all, we should keep in mind it was the United States, it was US imperialism that backed the coup that prevented Lula from becoming president in 2018. The US Justice Department was deeply involved in supporting something called Lava Jato, which means car wash, Operation Car Wash, which was a lawfare campaign. Lawfare is another term for legal warfare or judicial warfare. In Brazil, the judicial system was weaponized by the right wing, by the oligarchy, and by US imperialism against the Workers' Party. And that was what was used to justify the coup that removed Dilma Rousseff from power in Brazil in 2016. And then in 2018, Lula da Silva was imprisoned on fake charges of corruption. And the Supreme Court in Brazil, which is very right-wing, later admitted that those charges against Lula da Silva were false, and his record was expunged, and he's now completely innocent. And the United Nations itself, a working group of legal experts, said that the imprisonment of Lula was on false grounds and it was a politically motivated case. And that case was overseen directly by the US Justice Department. And that is how Bolsonaro came to power in the first place in 2018. That is to say that Bolsonaro only came to power because of 2 US-backed political coups. And in 2018, when Bolsonaro came to power, he had the backing of significant parts of the US capitalist class, the European capitalist class, and the corporate media, including media outlets like Bloomberg, which is owned by the US billionaire Michael Bloomberg, and other media outlets. There are elements of the capitalist class in Brazil who have turned against Bolsonaro because he's been so destructive for the economy. The economy has continued shrinking under him because of these brutal neoliberal capitalist policies imposed by his economic minister, Paulo Guedes, the Chicago boy. So there are parts of the Brazilian capitalist class that have come out in support of Lula, not because they support the Workers' Party, but because they see him as a lesser evil, because his time in office in Brazil, in his time, the Brazilian economy grew by 4 times. It went from around 700 billion to $2 trillion in terms of GDP.
Mr. Norton, how would you describe the policies that Lula has been implemented or will implement in Brazil?
So in terms of Lula's time in office, he didn't pursue a socialist agenda, but he pursued an economic nationalist agenda in which significant natural resources were nationalized by the Brazilian state, and the Brazilian state supported large state-owned companies like Petrobras, which is the largest company in Brazil, which is the oil fossil fuel giant. And those companies allowed the state to develop a significant revenue that it used to fund social programs to fight poverty and support industrialization. It's not necessarily a socialist policy, but it's referred to as import substitution industrialization, as opposed to export reliant industrialization, in which Brazil is turned to a resource colony to extract raw materials and export them to other countries and use that to develop. That is the neoliberal model that Bolsonaro has proposed and has been implementing, and it's led to an economic recession in Brazil, whereas the import substitution industrialization model, the economic nationalist model pursued by Lula, led to massive economic growth. So there are parts of the capitalist class that actually prefer Lula, not because they share his economic worldview, but because genuinely their class interests were better served. And furthermore, there's also the role of simply liberalism in the sense of social liberalism, not just economic liberalism. So what we see in Bolsonaro is deep economic liberalism, hyper liberalism, neoliberalism, but his cultural social policy is deeply anti-liberal. He's very much against feminism, against LGBT rights. He's very racist. And Brazil is a country where over half of the population is Black, is of African descent. And Bolsonaro himself is very deeply racist. So there are liberal capitalists who oppose Bolsonaro, not because of his economic policies, but because of his social policies. And this explains why there are certain NGOs that, are supportive of LGBT rights and anti-racism and feminism that are more supportive of Lula.
And what about George Soros?
But when we talk about certain factions of the ruling class, like Soros, who represent a certain wing of the liberal wing of the capitalist class, who support LGBT rights and anti-racism and feminism, we should also keep in mind that doesn't mean that those things are bad. I mean, the ruling class is internally divided. There is a more fascist wing of the ruling class, of the capitalist class, and there's a more liberal wing. And let's keep in mind that George Soros, even though I think he's a deeply destructive character in terms of the economic influence he has, because George Soros is also deeply neoliberal, but we should keep in mind that George Soros, for instance, is anti-Zionist. He's very much against Israel because Soros recognizes that apartheid Israel is a deeply fascistic regime, and he supports a form of liberal or social democratic, maybe at the best, liberalism. So just because the liberal faction of the capitalist class supports a certain policy doesn't mean that it's inherently wrong. I mean, anti-Zionism should be the policy of anti-imperialists and the left. And there are a lot of capitalist oligarchs who support Zionism. So in many ways, Soros, of course, is against the left, but there are certain issues in which the left, is in agreement. So in the case of Lula da Silva, there are certain elements of the capitalist class who support Lula, but that doesn't mean that they support him because they're supposedly leftist or that Lula is not the left.
Well, is Lula da Silva a socialist?
He's not a socialist. He's not pledging to expropriate the wealth of the Brazilian capitalist class. What he's calling for is economic nationalism, a model of import substitution industrialization, as opposed to the export-oriented neoliberal model that turns Brazil into a resource extraction hub that we've seen under Bolsonaro. And Lula also wants an independent foreign policy based on South-South cooperation. Let's not forget, Lula da Silva was one of the co-founders of the BRICS system. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Lula da Silva has also called for creating a new Latin American currency that is not backed by the US dollar. And he said he wants to free Latin America from the US dollar. Lula da Silva understands imperialism. He was a victim of a US-backed coup that led to him being imprisoned. So Bolsonaro, on the other hand, has been the most pro-US Brazilian leader since the military dictatorship that was installed by a US-backed coup and was in power until the 1980s. Bolsonaro himself was part of the military during the military dictatorship, and he has praised the military dictatorship and called for returning to the military dictatorship. Now, it's true that Bolsonaro and the Democrats in the US do not get along because of the policies of, cultural liberalism. And, Bolsonaro is deeply racist and anti-LGBT and homophobic and anti-feminist. But at the same time, Bolsonaro has been strongly supported by the US, and he himself constantly waves the US flag and the Israeli flag at his rallies. It's very common at Bolsonaro rallies to see the Brazilian flag, the US flag, and the Israeli flag. He, especially when Trump was in power, he was completely subservient to the United States. Lula da Silva wants to do what's best for Brazil's national interests, which means he's going to have good diplomatic relations with everyone. But a big part of his political and economic program is developing South-South cooperation with other countries in the global South to expand the BRIC system and to expand Latin American regional integration.